Shadows and swagger. Emma Reed was the type of nurse who could handle anything. From the unruly toddlers screaming their way through vaccinations to the quiet despair of elderly patients navigating the challenges of age, Emma's calm demeanor and steady hands made her a cornerstone of the local clinic. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was work she was proud of. The clinic sat nestled between a modest diner and a thrift store in the heart of a small town, where everyone knew everyone, except the occasional stranger passing through. On most days, the atmosphere was subdued. Patients waiting quietly, doctors making their rounds, and Emma juggling tasks with practiced efficiency. But today was not most days. The sudden roar of motorcycles announced their arrival before the door even swung open. Emma glanced up, her hand steady as she wrapped a blood pressure cuff around an elderly man's frail arm. The door slammed against the wall with a bang that made every head in the waiting room snap up. A group of men swaggered in, led by one whose presence dominated the space immediately. Mick. She'd seen his type before, loud, self-assured, and always looking for trouble. He strutted into the room, his leather jacket creaking as he moved, the chains on his boots clinking with every step. His eyes swept the room like a predator surveying its prey. Well, what do we have here? Mick drawled, a smirk curling on his lips. His voice carried a sharp edge of mockery. A nice little clinic for the locals. How quaint. Emma kept her eyes on her patient, her voice even as she said, "Can I help you?" Mick turned to her, his grin widening. "You're the help here. Cute." The bikers laughed, their chuckles low and menacing, echoing in the room. Emma felt the tension ripple through the patients, a young mother clutching her baby closer, an older gentleman shifting uncomfortably in his chair. She could feel the biker's eyes on her, weighing her response. Without missing a beat, she finished adjusting the blood pressure cuff and offered the elderly man a reassuring smile. "You're all set, Mr. Walker. Take care, and we'll see you next week." The older man gave her a grateful nod before hobbling out, his cane tapping softly against the floor. Emma turned to face Mick, her back straight and her eyes steady. "If you need medical attention, take a number and have a seat. Otherwise, I suggest you leave." The laughter stopped. Mick's grin faltered for a moment before returning, sharper this time. "Feisty. I like that," he said, taking a step closer. "But you don't look like you're in any position to tell me what to do." Emma's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. She dealt with aggressive patients before, and she knew better than to show fear. "This is a clinic," she said firmly. "You're disrupting our operations and making people uncomfortable. If you don't leave, I'll have to call security." "Security?" Mick barked out a laugh, turning to his crew. "Hear that, boys? She's calling the cavalry." The others joined in, their laughter louder this time, filling the room with a sense of dread. Emma's fingers curled into fists at her sides. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she also couldn't let them intimidate her or the patients. "What's your problem, sweetheart?" Mick asked, leaning on the counter. "You don't like a little company." "My problem," Emma said, her voice steady, "is people who think they can throw their weight around without consequences. You don't scare me." The room fell silent, the tension crackling like a live wire. Mick's smirk slipped, replaced by a flicker of surprise. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by someone like her, but he recovered quickly, leaning in closer until there were only inches between them. "You've got guts," he said softly, his voice dripping with mock admiration. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Emma didn't flinch, didn't back down. She met his gaze head-on, her own voice unwavering. "Maybe not, but it's still my clinic, and I won't let you or anyone else bully people here." Before Mick could respond, the door swung open again, this time with a deliberate, measured creak. A man stepped inside, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and faded jeans, his boots scuffed from wear. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene with a calm intensity that silenced the bikers almost immediately. Jake Reed, Emma's brother. He didn't say a word at first, letting his presence speak for itself. Mick turned to him, his bravado faltering for just a moment before he puffed up again. "And who's this?" "Another Good Samaritan." Jake stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up his prey. His gaze flicked to Emma, who gave him the smallest nod. A signal she wasn't backing down, but she wouldn't mind the backup. "I'm her brother," Jake said, his voice low and even. "And I don't appreciate the way you're talking to her." Mick smirked, though the confidence behind it was starting to waver. "Oh yeah? What are you gonna do about it?" Jake's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Why don't you stick around and find out?" The room held its breath, the bikers exchanging uncertain glances. Mick's hand twitched at his side, as though considering whether to push his luck or cut his losses. Emma stood silently, watching the interplay between the two men. She knew her brother's training, his discipline. Mick had no idea who he was dealing with, but Emma did, and for the first time that day, she felt the weight of the situation lift slightly from her shoulders. Whatever happened next, she knew Jake wouldn't let her face it alone. The fractured calm. The aftermath of Mick's departure left the clinic quieter, but not peaceful. Patients resumed their place in the waiting room, their murmurs tinged with unease. Emma moved efficiently, offering smiles and gentle reassurances as she directed her focus back to her duties. But beneath her composed exterior, her thoughts churned like a storm. She wasn't unfamiliar with confrontation. Being a nurse in a busy clinic often meant dealing with more than just medical emergencies. But Mick's intrusion wasn't just about intimidation. It felt calculated, like he had something to prove. And now, with her brother Jake's unexpected intervention, the tension had shifted in ways Emma couldn't fully grasp. Jake leaned against the wall near the door, his presence still commanding even in stillness. His eyes followed Emma as she worked, his expression unreadable. When the last of the patients were called into exam rooms, Emma finally turned to him. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I had it under control." Jake raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint smirk. "Yeah. Because from where I stood, it looked like they were about to cross a line." "They wouldn't have," Emma replied, brushing past him to straighten a stack of charts on the counter. "Guys like that just want to scare people. It's all for show." Jake's smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Maybe. But I've seen what happens when you underestimate people like them." Emma paused, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. She didn't doubt Jake's experience. His years in special forces had given him an unflinching perspective on human behavior. Still, this was her world, her domain. She couldn't afford to look weak, not in front of her patients, and not to herself. "Jake," she said, turning to face him, "I appreciate what you did, but I don't need you stepping in every time someone tries to rattle me. I can handle it." Jake studied her for a moment, his gaze steady but thoughtful. Then he nodded, the smallest hint of respect in his expression. "Fair enough," he said. "But if they come back, you're calling me. No arguments." Emma opened her mouth to protest, but stopped when she saw the resolve in his eyes. There was no point arguing with Jake when he'd made up his mind. She sighed. "Fine, but don't go playing hero. This is a clinic, not a battlefield." Jake chuckled softly, the tension between them easing just a little. "Understood, nurse." By late afternoon, the clinic had settled back into its usual rhythm. The flow of patients slowed as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the small parking lot. Emma busied herself with paperwork, grateful for the lull. But even as she worked, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Mick's departure wasn't the end of the trouble. Her instincts proved correct. The sharp rumble of motorcycle engines shattered the quiet, growing louder until it was impossible to ignore. Emma froze, her pen hovering over a chart. A glance out the window confirmed her fears. Mick and his crew were back, their bikes lined up like a barricade across the clinic's entrance. "Of course," she muttered under her breath. Jake, who had taken a seat in the corner with a worn paperback, looked up at the sound. His expression darkened as he followed her gaze. Without a word, he stood and moved toward the door. "Wait," Emma said, stopping him with a hand on his arm. "Don't escalate this. Let me handle it." Jake hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Emma, please," she insisted, her voice firm. "This is my clinic, my responsibility." Jake met her gaze, the tension between them palpable. Finally, he stepped back, though his posture remained tense, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Emma took a steadying breath before stepping outside. The bikers were gathered around their motorcycles, their laughter and jeers carrying across the parking lot. Mick leaned against his bike, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He grinned when he saw her. "Well, if it isn't Nurse Tough," he drawled. "Miss me already?" Emma crossed her arms, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't a bar or a clubhouse. You're trespassing, and you're disrupting my work. I'm asking you to leave." Mick exhaled a plume of smoke, his grin widening. "You've got guts, sweetheart. I'll give you that. But see, we're not here for trouble. We're just enjoying the view." The others laughed, their leering gazes making Emma's skin crawl. She forced herself to stand tall, her heart pounding in her chest. "You've made your point. Now leave." Mick's grin faded, his expression hardening. "Or what?" Emma didn't flinch even as her pulse quickened. "Or I call the police." Mick snorted, tossing his cigarette to the ground and crushing it under his boot. "Go ahead, but we both know they won't get here in time to stop anything." The implication hung in the air, heavy and menacing. Emma's resolve wavered, but before she could respond, the clinic door opened behind her. Jake stepped outside, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic. He didn't say a word, just stood there, his gaze locked on Mick. The tension crackled like static electricity, the bikers exchanging uncertain glances. Mick's bravado faltered, but he forced a smirk. "What, Big Brother here to save the day again?" Jake's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Just making sure you understand where the line is." Mick chuckled, though the sound lacked conviction. "And what line is that?" Jake took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. "The one where you walk away before you make a mistake you can't take back." The bikers shifted uneasily, the confidence they'd displayed earlier eroding under Jake's steady gaze. Mick held his ground, but the cracks in his facade were starting to show. "Look," Jake continued, his tone even but firm, "this isn't about proving who's tougher. It's about respect. You've had your fun. Now it's time to leave." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mick sneered, spitting on the ground. "Let's go," he muttered, turning toward his bike. The others hesitated before following his lead, their retreat slow and reluctant. As the roar of their engines faded into the distance, Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, glancing at Jake. "Yes, I did," he replied, his gaze still fixed on the empty parking lot. "And I'll do it again if I have to." Emma didn't argue. She knew he meant it, and deep down, she was grateful. But she also knew this wasn't the end. Mick wasn't the type to let a challenge go unanswered. And the next time, he wouldn't just bring his swagger, he'd bring trouble. The warning signs. Emma couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest since the bikers' retreat. Though they were gone for now, their parting glances and muttered threats lingered in her mind like the acrid scent of Mick's crushed cigarette. The clinic fell back into its rhythm as the day wound down, but Emma couldn't relax. The sense of looming danger gnawed at her, and she found herself glancing out the window more often than usual. Jake, ever watchful, remained in the corner with his book, though she knew his attention was on her and the clinic. He was always like that, quiet, steady, and protective to a fault. While she appreciated his presence, she also knew it was a temporary reprieve. Jake wouldn't stay forever, and she couldn't rely on him to fix her problems. She had to find a way to handle this herself. As the last patient of the day left, Emma locked the clinic doors and let out a deep sigh. The silence felt oppressive rather than comforting. She turned to Jake, who had just stood up, his towering frame casting long shadows in the dim light of the reception area. "They'll be back," she said, her voice low but resolute. Jake nodded, his expression serious. "Probably. People like Mick don't walk away from a fight easily." Emma frowned, running a hand through her hair. "I don't understand why they're targeting us. This is just a small-town clinic. What's the point?" Jake leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Bullies don't need a reason. They see a place where they think they can assert control, and they take it. It's about power, not logic." "But why here?" she pressed, pacing the room. "There's nothing for them to gain." Jake's brow furrowed as he considered her question. "Maybe it's not about the clinic. Maybe it's about you." Emma stopped mid-step, her stomach twisting. "Me? Why would I matter to them?" Jake shrugged. "Could be something personal. Could be they see you as someone who won't fight back, or someone they think will break under pressure." The thought made Emma's skin crawl, but she pushed the fear aside. "Well, they've got another thing coming if they think I'm going to roll over for them." Jake's lips curled into a faint smile. "That's the spirit. But you don't have to face this alone." Emma shook her head. "I appreciate you stepping in, Jake, but you can't be here every time they show up. I need to find a way to deal with this on my own." Jake studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I get it," he said finally. "But that doesn't mean I'm leaving you to handle it alone. I've got a few ideas." Later that evening, after locking up the clinic and heading home, Emma found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched dinner. The day's events replayed in her mind like a bad movie. She tried to focus on the mundane tasks of the evening, washing dishes, folding laundry, but the knot of unease in her stomach refused to loosen. Her phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from Jake. "Meet me at the old quarry. I've got something to show you." Emma frowned, her exhaustion warring with curiosity. The quarry was a short drive out of town, a place where locals occasionally gathered for bonfires or off-road adventures. Jake had always been drawn to the rugged isolation of it, using it as a spot to clear his mind or train when he was home. With a sigh, Emma grabbed her keys and headed out. The gravel crunched under her tires as she pulled up to the quarry. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the jagged rocks and sparse trees. Jake's truck was parked nearby, its headlights cutting through the darkness. As Emma stepped out of her car, the cool night air sent a shiver down her spine. "Over here," Jake called, his voice carrying across the open space. She followed the sound and found him standing near a makeshift setup of old tires, ropes, and wooden crates. It looked like some kind of training ground, though rough and improvised. "What is this?" Emma asked, folding her arms. Jake smirked. "A crash course in self-defense." Emma blinked, caught off guard. "You're kidding, right?" "Not at all," Jake said, his tone serious. "If Mick and his crew come back, and they will, you need to be ready. I can't always be there to step in. And I don't want you relying on anyone else to protect yourself." Emma hesitated, looking at the setup. "Jake, I'm not a fighter. I don't even know where to start." "That's why I'm here," he said, stepping closer. "You don't need to be a fighter. You just need to know enough to protect yourself and make it clear you're not an easy target." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know." "Trust me," Jake said, his voice softening. "This isn't about turning you into a soldier. It's about giving you the confidence to stand your ground when it matters." Emma looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't pushing her out of some macho need to fix things. He genuinely wanted her to feel safe. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. "Okay, what do I need to do?" The first hour was grueling. Jake walked her through the basics of situational awareness, teaching her how to read body language and anticipate potential threats. Then came the physical training: how to break free from a grab, how to throw a punch, how to use leverage to her advantage. Emma struggled at first, her movements awkward and hesitant. But Jake was patient, offering encouragement and corrections without judgment. Slowly, she began to find her rhythm, her confidence growing with each successful maneuver. By the end of the session, Emma was exhausted but invigorated. Her muscles ached, and her hands were raw from gripping ropes and punching padded targets, but she felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't expected. "You did good," Jake said, handing her a bottle of water. Emma took it with a tired smile. "I still feel like I have a long way to go." "That's okay," Jake replied. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being prepared." She nodded, sipping the water and letting his words sink in. For the first time that day, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she couldn't stop Mick and his crew from coming back, but she could make sure they didn't see her as an easy target. As they packed up and headed back to their vehicles, Jake placed a hand on her shoulder. "Remember, Emma, confidence is half the battle. Show them you're not afraid, and they'll think twice before messing with you again." Emma nodded, the determination in her eyes mirroring his. Whatever was coming, she would face it head-on, and she wouldn't face it alone. Shadows loom. The next morning brought with it a deceptive sense of normalcy. The sun peeked through the clinic's blinds, casting warm streaks across the reception desk. Emma arrived early, her muscles still aching from the impromptu training session with Jake. Despite the soreness, she felt sharper, more aware of her surroundings and ready for whatever the day might bring. The waiting room began to fill as the morning progressed, with patients trickling in for routine checkups and prescriptions. The hum of quiet conversation and the beeping of monitors created a backdrop of calm. But Emma's vigilance didn't waver. She glanced frequently at the entrance, watching for any sign of trouble. Jake's parting words from the night before echoed in her mind. "Confidence is half the battle. Show them you're not afraid." By mid-morning, the clinic's usual rhythm was disrupted by a delivery driver dropping off a shipment of supplies. Emma signed for the packages, chatting briefly with the driver before hauling the boxes into the storeroom. She had just begun sorting through the items when a soft knock at the door startled her. "Emma," a voice called. It was Carla, the clinic's receptionist. Emma poked her head out of the storeroom. "What's up?" Carla hesitated, her eyes darting toward the waiting room. "There's someone here asking for you. He's not a patient, and, well, he gives me a bad feeling." Emma's stomach sank. "What does he look like?" "Tall, leather jacket, tattoos," Carla said, lowering her voice. "He's not one of those guys from yesterday, is he?" Emma's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Stay here," she said. "I'll handle it." Walking into the reception area, Emma immediately spotted him, a lanky man leaning against the counter, his arms crossed. He wasn't Mick, but the skull and flames patch on his jacket marked him as one of Mick's crew. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "You're Emma, right?" he said, his voice oily. Emma crossed her arms, planting her feet firmly. "Who's asking?" The man smirked. "Name's Travis. Mick sent me." The room seemed to hold its breath. Patients shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, and Carla hovered behind the counter, her expression tense. Emma glanced at the exit, calculating her options. She could ask him to leave, but Travis didn't seem like the type to take no for an answer. "What does Mick want?" Emma asked, keeping her voice steady. Travis leaned closer, his grin widening. "Oh, nothing much. Just a little chat. Says you've got a way of talking to people that rubs him the wrong way. Thought maybe I'd swing by and remind you how things work around here." Emma's pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. "This is a clinic," she said, her tone firm. "I don't have time for games. If Mick has something to say, he can come himself." Travis chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But Mick doesn't like waiting, sweetheart. He wants to see you tonight, down at the Rusted Barrel. Emma clenched her jaw. The Rusted Barrel was a seedy dive bar on the outskirts of town, known for hosting bikers and bar fights. She'd never set foot in the place, and she had no intention of starting now. I'm not interested, she said curtly. Tell Mick to find someone else to bother. Travis's grin faded, his eyes narrowing. You don't get it, do you? When Mick says jump, you jump. Unless you want things to get messy. Emma didn't blink, didn't back down. Is that a threat? Call it a suggestion, Travis said, his voice low and dangerous. You've got until tonight to change your mind. Don't keep Mick waiting. Without waiting for a response, Travis pushed off the counter and sauntered out of the clinic, leaving a trail of tension in his wake. Emma stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She knew Mick was testing her, trying to intimidate her into submission. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the clinic, her patients, and the people who relied on her. Carla approached cautiously. What are you going to do? Emma took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. I'm not going anywhere near that bar. But I'm not letting them scare me off, either. That evening, Emma locked up the clinic with an unshakable sense of foreboding. Jake had been right. Mick wasn't the type to let things go. As much as she hated to admit it, she needed backup. She drove straight to Jake's house, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When she arrived, Jake was outside, working on his truck. He looked up as she pulled into the driveway, his expression instantly shifting to concern. What happened? He asked, wiping his hands on a rag as she stepped out of the car. Emma quickly explained the day's events, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. They want me to meet them at the Rusted Barrel tonight. I said no, but I don't think they're going to drop it. Jake's jaw tightened. You're right. They won't. Guys like Mick don't take no for an answer. So what do I do? Emma asked, crossing her arms. I can't let them control me, but I also can't risk them coming back to the clinic. Jake was silent for a moment, his gaze distant as he considered their options. Then he nodded to himself, as if reaching a decision. We're not going to the Rusted Barrel, he said firmly. That's their turf, and it's exactly where they want you. We're going to send them a message instead. Emma frowned. What kind of message? Jake's lips curled into a faint smile, the kind that makes them think twice about messing with you. An hour later, they were parked outside a diner near the edge of town, a place Jake knew Mick's crew frequented. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her nerves on edge as Jake outlined his plan. You stay here, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I'll handle this. Jake, this is my fight, Emma protested. And you're handling it by letting me do what I do best, Jake said, his eyes steady. Trust me, Emma. This is the only language guys like Mick understand. Before she could argue further, Jake stepped out of the truck and strode into the diner. Emma watched anxiously, her heart pounding as she tried to anticipate what would happen next. Inside, Jake's presence was immediately felt. The low murmur of conversation halted as heads turned to watch him approach a table in a corner where Travis and two other bikers sat. Jake didn't waste time with pleasantries. Travis, he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. We need to talk. Travis looked up, his smirk faltering when he saw Jake's face. Well, if it isn't the hero, he said, trying to mask his unease with bravado. What can I do for you? Jake leaned forward, his gaze piercing. You can start by backing off my sister. Travis chuckled nervously. Look, man, it's nothing personal. Mick just. Don't, Jake interrupted, his voice sharp. I don't care what Mick wants. This ends now. You leave her alone, or I make sure you regret it. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence eroded by Jake's unwavering demeanor. Travis opened his mouth to respond, but Jake cut him off. I'm not here to argue, Jake said, his tone cold. I'm here to warn you. You've got one chance to walk away. Don't waste it. The tension was palpable as Jake held Travis's gaze, his calm resolve more intimidating than any threat could be. After a long moment, Travis nodded stiffly. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll back off." Jake straightened, his eyes scanning the table one last time. "See that you do." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving the bikers to stew in uneasy silence. As he climbed back into the truck, Emma looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "What did you say to them?" she asked. "Enough," Jake replied, starting the engine. "But don't let your guard down. This isn't over yet." Emma nodded, her determination renewed. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, with Jake by her side. The storm breaks. The morning after Jake confronted Travis and his crew at the diner, Emma awoke to a gnawing sense of unease. She had hoped that Jake's warning would be enough to dissuade Mick and his gang, but deep down, she knew better. Men like Mick didn't back down easily, especially not when their pride was at stake. Emma arrived at the clinic early, hoping to get a head start on the day. As she unlocked the front door, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. A small patch of blackened asphalt near the clinic's entrance, where the unmistakable remnants of a fire lay smoldering. The smell of burnt rubber and gasoline hung in the air, acrid and oppressive. Her pulse quickened as she bent down to inspect the damage. It wasn't significant, just a charred patch of pavement and a few burnt scraps of cloth. But the message was clear. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a warning. Emma stood slowly, her gaze scanning the empty parking lot. The morning was quiet, but the weight of unseen eyes made her feel exposed. She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed Jake. Jake arrived within minutes, his truck kicking up gravel as he pulled into the lot. He stepped out, his expression dark as he approached Emma. She pointed silently to the blackened spot on the ground. "They did this," she said, her voice low but steady. Jake crouched to examine the area, his jaw tightening. "It's a scare tactic," he said. "They're trying to make you feel unsafe." "Well, it's working," Emma admitted, folding her arms. "But I can't let this stop me. The clinic needs to stay open." Jake rose to his full height, his expression grim. "You're right. They want to intimidate you, make you fold. But we're not giving them the satisfaction." "What do we do?" Emma asked, looking to him for guidance. Jake hesitated for a moment, his mind clearly working through their options. Then he nodded, as if coming to a decision. "First, we report this. They need to know that you're not going to ignore what's happening. Then we make it clear to Mick and his crew that this ends here." Emma frowned. "How? They're not exactly the type to listen to reason." Jake's eyes narrowed. "They don't have to listen to reason. They just need to understand that pushing you any further will cost them more than they're willing to pay." That afternoon, after filing a police report, Emma returned to the clinic with a renewed sense of determination. The officer who had taken her statement had been polite but non-committal, promising to look into it, without offering much reassurance. Emma knew she couldn't rely solely on the authorities to handle the situation. Jake stayed with her throughout the day, his presence a quiet but reassuring reminder that she wasn't alone. The clinic ran smoothly despite the morning's unsettling discovery, and Emma found herself falling back into the familiar rhythm of her work. But the tension lingered, an undercurrent of unease that refused to dissipate. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Jake excused himself briefly to make a phone call. Emma didn't ask for details. She trusted him to handle whatever needed to be done. Instead, she focused on preparing the clinic for closing. The last patient had just left when Emma heard the low rumble of motorcycle engines in the distance. Her stomach clenched as the sound grew louder, echoing off the surrounding buildings. She stepped to the window and pulled the blinds aside just enough to see. Mick and his crew were back. They parked their bikes in a loose formation near the clinic's entrance, their movements deliberate and menacing. Mick dismounted first, his leather jacket catching the fading light as he strode toward the door. His crew followed, their expressions a mix of smug confidence and quiet malice. Emma's heart pounded as she turned away from the window. She grabbed her phone and dialed Jake's number, her fingers trembling. He answered on the first ring. "They're here," she said, her voice hushed. "Lock the doors," Jake replied immediately. "I'm on my way." Emma hung up and quickly locked the front door, her mind racing. She glanced around the clinic, her thoughts jumping from one worst-case scenario to another. She couldn't let them in. But what if they tried to force their way inside? What if her staff or patients had still been near? The thought made her blood run cold. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. Mick stood on the other side, his smirk visible through the glass. He rapped his knuckles against the door again, harder this time. "Open up, sweetheart," he called, his voice dripping with mockery. "We just want to talk." Emma clenched her fists, taking a steadying breath before stepping closer to the door. "We're closed," she said firmly. "Leave." Mick chuckled, shaking his head. "Now that's not very neighborly of you. We went through all the trouble of stopping by, and you're going to shut us out." "Leave," Emma repeated, her voice louder this time. Mick's expression darkened, his smirk fading. He stepped closer to the glass, his tone turning cold. "You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." The rumble of an approaching truck cut through the tension like a knife. Mick and his crew turned as Jake's truck came into view, its headlights sweeping across the lot. He parked near the entrance and climbed out, his posture calm but unmistakably threatening. "Back off," Jake said, his voice low but commanding as he approached. Mick sneered, gesturing to his crew. "Look who it is, the hero Big Brother. Come to save the day again." Jake didn't respond immediately. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes locked on Mick. When he spoke, his voice was steady and deliberate. "This is your last warning. Walk away now, or you won't like what happens next." Mick laughed, the sound harsh and humorless. "You think you can scare us? You're outnumbered, pal." Jake's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "Try me." The tension crackled like a live wire, the bikers shifting uneasily as they exchanged glances. Mick's bravado wavered, but he forced a grin. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But this isn't over." Jake took a slow step closer, his eyes never leaving Mick's. "It is if you're smart." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mick let out a frustrated growl and turned away, motioning for his crew to follow. They mounted their bikes and roared out of the lot, their departure as loud and aggressive as their arrival. As the sound of engines faded into the distance, Jake turned to Emma, his expression softening. "You okay?" Emma nodded, though her hands were still shaking. "What happens now?" Jake's gaze hardened, his resolve clear. "We prepare. They'll be back, but next time, they'll regret it." Emma swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't face it alone. The reckoning. The morning after Mick's retreat, the air in the small town felt heavy, as if everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Emma had barely slept. She sat at her kitchen table, sipping cold coffee and staring blankly at the wall. The events of the past few days replayed in her mind like a broken record. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see Mick's sneer and hear his threats. Jake was already up, sitting across from her with a map of the town spread out on the table. He had been working since dawn, scribbling notes and making phone calls to contacts Emma didn't even know he had. His calm, methodical approach was reassuring, but it also underscored the seriousness of the situation. "They'll come back," Jake said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but firm. "And when they do, they'll bring everything they've got." Emma nodded, her throat tight. "So what do we do?" Jake tapped a pen against the map. "We make sure they regret it." The clinic opened as usual that day, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. Emma worked with a renewed sense of purpose, her eyes constantly scanning the waiting room, and the parking lot beyond. She had informed the staff of the situation in broad terms, urging them to stay vigilant but not panic. Carla, the receptionist, had taken the news surprisingly well, though she kept a baseball bat tucked discreetly under the counter. Jake had stationed himself in the corner of the waiting room, his presence a silent deterrent. He wasn't armed, at least, not visibly, but the air of quiet authority he exuded was enough to make anyone think twice about causing trouble. By mid-afternoon, the waiting room was empty, save for Jake and Emma. She was just finishing some paperwork when Jake's phone buzzed on the counter. He picked it up, his expression darkening as he read the message. "They're on the move," he said, his voice low. Emma froze, her pen hovering over the page. "What do you mean?" "One of my contacts spotted them heading this way," Jake replied, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Mick's bringing the whole crew this time." Emma's stomach churned, but she forced herself to stay calm. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 20 minutes, Jake said. "Plenty of time to get ready." The clinic became a hive of quiet activity. Jake locked the front doors and double-checked the windows, ensuring there were no easy entry points. He handed Emma a small canister of pepper spray, his expression serious. "Keep this on you," he said. "Only use it if you have to." Emma nodded, her grip tightening around the canister. "What about you?" Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled the walkie-talkie from his bag and handed it to her. "I'll be outside. If anything happens, call me." Emma hesitated. "Jake, this is my fight. You don't have to." "This is our fight," Jake interrupted, his voice firm. "And I'm not letting you face it alone." The rumble of engines announced their arrival long before they came into view. Emma watched from the window as Mick and his crew pulled into the parking lot, their bikes forming an imposing line near the entrance. There were more of them this time, at least a dozen, and their demeanor was anything but casual. This wasn't a visit. It was a confrontation. Mick dismounted first, his leather jacket catching the late afternoon sun. He glanced around, his eyes narrowing when he saw the locked doors and the empty parking lot. His smirk returned, sharp and menacing. Jake stepped out from the side of the building, his posture relaxed but purposeful. He walked toward Mick with the calm confidence of a man who had faced far worse than a group of bikers. Mick's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Look who it is," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Big brother, playing security guard." Jake stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "You've got a choice to make, Mick," he said, his tone even. "You can leave now, and we all move on. Or you can stay and find out what happens when you push too far." Mick laughed, though the sound was forced. "You think you can scare me? You're outnumbered." Jake's lips curled into a faint smile. "Numbers don't mean much when you don't know what you're doing." The tension crackled like electricity, the bikers shifting uneasily as they watched the exchange. Mick glanced back at his crew, then at Jake, as if weighing his options. "You think you're some kind of tough guy?" Mick sneered. "This isn't the military, pal. This is the real world." Jake's expression didn't change. "The real world has rules. You're breaking them." Mick took a step closer, his posture aggressive. "And what are you gonna do about it?" Jake's response was calm, almost casual. "You'll find out if you don't leave." For a moment, it seemed like Mick might back down, but then he snarled, turning to his crew. "Let's teach this guy a lesson." The bikers advanced, their movements deliberate. But they didn't get far. From the shadows of the parking lot, two men stepped into view, their plainclothes disguising the sharp authority in their stance. They were Jake's contacts, former comrades from his Special Forces days. They had been waiting, unseen, for this exact moment. "Hey, Mick," one of them called, his voice cold. "You sure you want to do this?" The bikers froze, their confidence wavering as they took in the newcomers. The two men moved closer, their presence adding an unmistakable weight to the confrontation. Mick's bravado faltered, but he forced a grin. "What, you brought backup? That's cute." Jake didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his gaze locked on Mick. "This is over," he said, his voice low and unyielding. "You're done." Mick hesitated, his eyes darting between Jake and the two men. He could feel the balance of power shifting, the inevitability of his defeat pressing down on him like a weight. Finally, he growled in frustration, turning back to his crew. "Let's go." The bikers mounted their bikes reluctantly, their earlier confidence replaced by a simmering resentment. Mick lingered for a moment, glaring at Jake before spitting on the ground. "This isn't over," he said. Jake's expression didn't waver. "Yes, it is." With a final snarl, Mick started his bike and roared out of the parking lot, his crew following close behind. The sound of their engines faded into the distance, leaving the clinic in an uneasy silence. Emma stepped outside, her legs shaky but her resolve intact. She looked at Jake, then at the two men standing beside him. "Is it really over?" she asked. Jake nodded, his expression softening. "They won't be back. Not after this." Emma exhaled, the weight of the past few days lifting slightly. She turned to Jake, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "Thank you." Jake shrugged, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Just doing what I had to do." As the sun set over the quiet town, Emma felt a renewed sense of strength. She had faced her fears, stood her ground, and come out the other side. And though the battle had been hard-fought, she knew she wasn't alone. Together, they had sent a message that neither Emma nor the clinic was a target. And that was something Mick and his crew wouldn't soon forget. A lasting resolve. The hum of the retreating motorcycles was soon replaced by a quiet stillness, but the tension lingered in the air. Emma stood beside Jake, her heart still pounding in her chest as she tried to process what had just happened. Though Mick and his crew were gone, the day's events had left their mark. Jake's two comrades, who had blended seamlessly into the shadows, stepped forward. They weren't intimidating in an overt way, but their calm demeanor and sharp eyes spoke volumes about their capabilities. One of them, a tall man with graying hair at his temples, extended his hand to Emma. "Name's Carter," he said, his voice steady. "Jake's told us a lot about you." Emma shook his hand, her grip firm despite her nerves. "Thank you for being here," she said sincerely. "I don't know what we would have done without you." The other man, stockier with a scar running along his jaw, smirked faintly. "Don't thank us yet. Guys like Mick don't always stay down for long. But this should buy you some peace." Jake stepped between them, his tone measured but serious. "It's not just about buying time. It's about making sure they know what's waiting for them if they come back." Emma frowned, worry creasing her brow. "Do you think they'll try something else?" "They might," Jake admitted. "Mick doesn't strike me as the type to let this go easily. But now he knows the stakes. He'll think twice before pushing his luck again." Carter nodded in agreement. "We've seen it before. Bullies back down when the cost gets too high." Emma took a deep breath, the weight of their words sinking in. "And what if they don't back down?" Jake's gaze softened as he turned to her. "Then we're ready for them. You're not in this alone, Emma." As night fell, the group moved inside the clinic to debrief and discuss their next steps. Jake's comrades, Carter and a scared man, who introduced himself as Mason, sat around the small staff breakroom table with Jake and Emma. The mood was somber but determined. "We need to make sure they don't feel like they can intimidate you or anyone here again," Mason said, his tone gruff but practical. "That means reinforcing your presence in the community." Emma tilted her head, confused. "What do you mean?" "Guys like Mick thrive on fear," Carter explained. "If the people in this town see you standing strong, they'll rally around you. Mick and his crew will lose the upper hand because they'll know they're not just facing you. They're facing the whole community." Emma considered his words. The idea of rallying the community was appealing, but she wasn't sure how to go about it. "How do we do that?" Jake leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Start small. Talk to the patients, the neighbors. Let them know what's been happening. People here trust you, Emma. They'll want to help." Mason nodded. "You'd be surprised how quickly a united front can shut down troublemakers like Mick." The next day, Emma took their advice to heart. She spoke openly with her regular patients, sharing just enough of the story to let them know the clinic had faced trouble but was standing firm. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Word spread quickly through the small town, and before long, Emma began receiving messages of support from locals offering to help in any way they could. The diner owner down the street offered to keep an eye on the clinic during off hours. A retired police officer volunteered to patrol the area in his free time. Even the teenagers who hung out near the skate park offered to keep watch for anything suspicious. Emma was touched by the outpouring of support, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of hope. The clinic wasn't just her responsibility, it was a part of the community, and the community was willing to stand with her. A week passed without any sign of Mick or his crew. The blackened patch of asphalt near the entrance had been cleaned, and the clinic returned to its usual hum of activity. But Emma remained vigilant, her newfound confidence reinforced by the training she continued with Jake in their spare time. One evening, as she closed up the clinic, she spotted a familiar truck pulling into the parking lot. Jake stepped out, his expression relaxed for the first time in days. "Looks quiet," he said, joining her by the door. Emma smiled faintly. "It's been quiet all week. Maybe they finally got the message." "Maybe," Jake said, though his tone held a note of caution. "But it's always good to be prepared." Emma nodded, grateful for his unshakable presence. "Thanks for everything, Jake. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Jake shrugged, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You're stronger than you think, Emma. I just gave you a little push." As they stood in the fading light, a sense of calm settled over them. The storm had passed, but the lessons it left behind would stay with Emma forever. She knew there would always be challenges, people like Mick who sought to tear others down. But now, she also knew she had the strength to stand tall, to fight back, and to protect what mattered most. And as long as Jake was around, she knew she'd never face those battles alone.